BBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
More of your financial concerns in a moment. 8 minutes before 8 is the time. Now, after 8, we're going to look at the Manchester inquiry in more detail. And to help us do that, let's bring to the conversation Conservative MP and Crime and Policing Minister Chris Philp, who joins me now. And when we read the inquiry has discovered that in some instances, and I appreciate your Crime and Policing Minister, but in some instances, fire crews were arriving 2 hours late. At one point, police cars were going in one direction towards the event. The fire engines were going the other way. Minister, what do we need to learn from, can I put to this chaotic shambles? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Look, there clearly are some very, very serious lessons to learn from this that were highlighted in yesterday's report, which I'm going to be studying very carefully, as you can imagine. It looks like there are two broad areas which need to be improved when, if an incident, a tragic incident like this, heaven forbid, ever happens again. And those are around speed of response and around the coordination between different emergency services, and we need to make sure that the recommendations in this report get implemented so that this doesn't happen again if we ever are in the terrible position of seeing something like this happen, which of course, we hope won't ever happen again. We're doing a lot of work to prevent this kind of thing happening again, but we do need to be ready to make sure that emergency services respond as well as they possibly can if it ever does.
Minister, what do you think went wrong? Because I'm sure you'll be the first to say that I'm not for a moment questioning the bravery of the police officers, the fire crews, the ambulance. For a moment, they're very brave men and women. But something has clearly gone catastrophic wrong. Is it senior command? Is it lack of training? Is it lack of drills? What do you imagine it might mean, Minister?
Well, I think the report goes into some of these. The report published yesterday afternoon goes into some of these issues. Part of it is around the coordination and the functioning of the command and control functions as the incident unfolded. As you say, the individual officers, police officers and fire officers are incredibly brave. Some of them were volunteering to go in and were being, the sort of control teams were saying, don't go in. So you're absolutely right to pay tribute to the bravery of the individual fire officers and police officers who were attending the scene and putting their lives in danger to protect others. But I think that the lessons are around the way these responses get coordinated and directed, and we've got to make sure those lessons are fully learnt and implemented if we ever find ourselves in the terrible position of witnessing this kind of thing again, which I obviously hope we won't, and we're doing everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen, but yeah, we've got to be prepared, of course.
Yeah, well, amen to that. Let's move to other areas. Until last year, of course, you were Minister for Immigration. Can I ask you, what do you think has gone so catastrophically wrong, both with the immigration process and singularly at the Manston Centre in Kent?
Well, the first problem we've got is just the sheer numbers of people who are coming across the English Channel. Of course, we're already accommodating a lot of people who we've chosen to welcome to the UK for protection reasons. 150,000 Ukrainians this year, 23,000 people from Afghanistan following the Taliban takeover. Over 100,000 people have arrived from Hong Kong, fleeing persecution by the Chinese Communist Party. And a few years ago, we welcomed, I think it was over 20,000 people from Syria who were being threatened by Assad. So we've been very generous as a country, rightly, in looking after people who are fleeing war and persecution. But when on top of all of that, you have this year it's been so far 40,000 people, roughly, just under, crossing the English Channel dangerously and illegally on these small boats. It puts the system under unbelievable pressure. And of course, not only are those channel crossings illegal, they're also totally unnecessary because France is a safe, civilised country with a well-functioning asylum system. No one needs to leave France to flee persecution, obviously. So these journeys don't need to happen. It's mostly young single men. It's not entirely, but it's mostly young single men making these journeys. And it's put the system under enormous amounts of pressure. So, and that's why we're seeing problems like those in Manston. Specifically on Manston, in the last 7 days, I understand a large number of people, about 1,000, have been moved out of that facility. At the same time, substantial improvements have been made to create better and less crowded accommodation, to improve the quality of the accommodation, to address the concerns that have been raised. But the system is under the most enormous pressure because of the sheer numbers of people illegally and unnecessarily entering the country. We've got, I think, over 30,000 people in hotels around the country,
Indeed.
Which is really a ridiculous situation.
It is, and it's costing the thick end of £7 million a day. Minister, you say illegally, but if I am in Kabul or I'm in Tirana, what is my legal route trying to gain access to come and live and work in the United Kingdom or to seek asylum status? How do I do that legally?
Yeah, well, there's a whole number of different legal routes. So for the most dangerous places, we've created specific routes. And I've actually mentioned a few of those already. So you mentioned Kabul. We've got the Operation Pitting last August evacuated a large number of people.
But today, Minister.
Well, so today we've got running the Arak and Arap schemes where people are evacuated either from Afghanistan or from countries adjacent to Afghan citizens in adjacent countries. When Assad was persecuting his own people during the appalling civil war there, supported, of course, by Putin, we ran the resettlement scheme where we directly took Syrian refugees. By the way, they were often vulnerable people, like people with illnesses or women and children and so on, Syrian citizens from Syria or countries just around Syria, and brought them to the UK. So those specific routes exist. There is also refugee family reunion. I think 40,000 people have come through that route in the last 5 or 6 years. And then, of course, if somebody comes to the UK directly from a place of danger, like they get a flight from Tehran, then their asylum claim obviously gets considered. What I think is not acceptable, or either legally or morally, is where someone is already in a safe European country, like France, but typically they've passed through Belgium and Germany and other countries beforehand. They're in a safe country. They're not fleeing war. There is no war in France. France is completely safe and civilised. You don't need to leave France on a small dinghy to come to the UK, and that is what is putting the system under just enormous pressure, under sheer weight of numbers.
Last couple of minutes together, the Home Secretary went down to see the situation in Manston herself yesterday. There is some criticism. Was it really necessary for her to use a Chinook helicopter at a cost of £3,500 per hour? Let's say she was in the air in two and a half hours. £10,000. Why couldn't she quite rightly have had a fast police escort down the A20?
So my understanding was that the helicopter wasn't simply to get from A to B. She was also inspecting operations in the English Channel, where obviously these boats are crossing. So it was for that wider purpose. And in fact, when I was in France a year or two ago, when I was immigration minister, as you said, the French authorities there took me in a helicopter to look at the French beaches and look at the places where these illegal embarkations
were. What did you learn
were
from
taking
being
place
airborne? What did you learn from being airborne, Minister?
You get a much. That's a good question. You get a much better sense of the terrain. You understand the operational area. You can see the routes to the beaches. You can see the embarkation points. You can see where the gendarmes patrol from. So you get a much better sense of what is going on the ground. And that was a French gendarme helicopter. It wasn't paid for by the UK taxpayer, I should add. And it did add a lot of perspective to the situation.
Finally, a word on the financial situation. You'll have been expecting this. We've had the biggest rate rise for 30 years. We could be looking at a very bleak period of recession. How much was Trussonomics a contributory factor to this disaster?
Well, I think if you look at things like the currency and government bond yields, which obviously deteriorated 3 or 4 or 5 weeks ago, those numbers are now back pretty much to where they were before. We obviously have a global economic problem. Inflation in the Eurozone is 10%, the same as it is here. In Germany, it's 12%. In Holland, it's 14%. The IMF say one-third of... Yeah, the Eurozone average is 10, the same as it is here. The IMF are saying a third of global economies are going to go into recession. So these are global problems. We need to meet them. And I think when the new Chancellor sets out his plans on the 17th of November, we'll see how he plans to do that.
Do you think you deserve, really, the public deserve an apology from you, reminding everyone you were effectively 2IC, second in command of the Treasury, you were Chief Secretary, and in an interview with Channel 4 last night, Andrew Bailey said, "I think at the point when we intervened, I can tell you the messages we were getting from the markets were that it was hours before complete financial Armageddon after a run on the pound." Now is your opportunity to say, I'm sure you were well motivated, but simply to apologise for what you and your senior colleagues did.
Well, so I was a minister at the time, as you say.
Very senior minister.
The decisions around the mini budget were taken principally by the then Prime Minister, to a lesser extent the then Chancellor. They took those decisions, as you would expect. They were taken at the very top.
You didn't sign off on them. You were against them.
No, I wasn't the decision maker. And Liz Truss actually subsequently in a BBC interview, I think it was with Chris Mason, a few weeks ago, did apologise. But as I say, the currency exchange rate and the government bond yields are back in, broadly speaking, back to where they were before. And you mentioned the rate rise yesterday, which the Bank of England, obviously independent, put rates up. The American Federal Reserve put rates up by exactly the same amount the previous day, which I think makes the point. But this is a global situation.
I hear you, Minister, but we've been to the United States, we've been to Holland, we've been to other countries in our discussions. Can I just say, I appreciate you were Chief Secretary of the Treasury, you were 2IC, second in command, but do you not think you owe an apology to the British public?
Well, as I say, I wasn't the decision maker. I didn't take the decisions.
Were you against the decisions then? Can I ask that?
Well, I was. I mean, so I think the strategy they had to try and drive growth was a sort of well-founded strategy. I had a view myself that it should have been a balanced package with looking at the spending side of the ledger as well as the tax side, and that there should have been a sort of fiscal framework sitting around that. Neither of which obviously happened. And of course, what the new Chancellor and new Prime Minister are doing is exactly that in their 17th of November
Indeed, but
statement.
You were
overruled.
and
that's why ultimately I wasn't the decision maker, as you'd expect. Those kind of massive decisions about the economy.
Let's leave it with.
Very top.
Let's leave it with. Thank you. Unless you were not overruled, we'll leave the interview there. It's over to you. You were overruled. I'm grateful for your time. Crime and Policing Minister Chris Philp appearing here on LBC. Thank you. We are a little late. 3 minutes after 8. News. Lottie Morley.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation.